Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. Madeline Polmear joins us to discuss how engineers' emotions can affect their engagement with ethics and ethical design practices. But before we introduce Dr. Polmear, I'll say a little bit about our speaker series and how you can participate. Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who is Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time, and we encourage you to visit the UCF Center website for ethically speaking. That's at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. But we'd also like to hear from you for your feedback and ideas for future topics in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and the importance of ethics at UCF, I think, is clear from the long list of inaugural partners who helped launch this series that you can see on the slide there. And all of us in this partnership hope you enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates some understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's event is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with your friends. Dr. Jonathan Beaver is hosting today's speaker, and at the end of the presentation, Dr. Polmear will take questions moderated by Jonathan. Please submit your questions directly to him via chat. So now I will turn things over to Jonathan to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Steve. I'm really glad to see everybody here. Thank you for being here, and I'm really excellently pleased to introduce to you all Dr. Madeline Polmear. Maddie is a lecturer in the UK, so an assistant professor equivalent here in the US system, in engineering ethics at King's College London. Her research focuses on ethics and societal responsibility in engineering education, with an emphasis on the role of emotions. At King's College, she teaches introduction to engineering and engineering design courses, emphasizing the place of socio-technological integration in engineering. Maddie received her PhD in civil engineering from University of Colorado at Boulder and has been a Marie Sklodowska Curie Utopia Co-Fund Fellow in RIA Universitat Brussels, Belgium, where she studied macroethical development among engineering students. I've had the pleasure of following Dr. Polmear's career for some time now through research and service intersections with her in the engineering education community, and I know that community of engineering educators to be research-driven, welcoming, and impressively engaged. And so it should be no surprise to anyone, including myself, that Dr. Polmear is at home there in that community as she mirrors those very same qualities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Polmear to Ethically Speaking.
Great. Thank you, first of all, Jonathan and Steve, for that wonderful introduction and opportunity to talk with you all today. I'll go ahead and all right, is that showing up okay? All right, perfect. Yeah, so today I will be talking about the intersection between ethics and emotion, and particularly what that means for engineering education and the professional formation of future engineers. And so I first want to start with the premise that ethics is an integral part of engineering. As Steve mentioned, it's a part of every facet of our personal and professional lives, and I think that's particularly true in engineering because on both micro and macro scales, engineers make decisions that affect individuals, entire communities, the natural and built environment, and these engineers, as decision makers, are embedded in organizations that can span many stakeholders across various sociocultural contexts. And so decisions like balancing safety, cost, and time pressure on large infrastructure projects, or accounting for environmental justice when considering the impact of air pollution, designing for inclusion and accessibility, the responsible use of AI for analyzing data or predicting outcomes. All of these decisions exist at the intersection between ethics and engineering. But I think it's also important to point out that these decisions are not purely based on reason and rationality. As much as the culture of engineering and the stereotype of engineers rests on this idea of like objectivity and technical expertise, emotion also plays a crucial role in how decisions are made, and also how people engage with dealing with ethics and learning about these issues. So this can be maybe the visceral reaction you have when you're confronted with a challenge, or that decision to follow your gut and only be able to rationalize it afterwards. All of these issues kind of tie together in talking about this interplay between ethics, emotion, and engineering education. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. So Jonathan offered a very nice introduction to my background, but just to give a kind of sense of where I ended up in this area, I started doing engineering education research as an undergraduate student, and that started looking at how the climate of engineering can affect women's retention and experience within the field. And that kind of moved on to looking at capstone design and outcomes assessment around that. I've also looked at education and outreach projects, considering the environmental and societal impact of oil and natural gas development. My PhD focused on macroethics education. Then I did a postdoc in workforce development and out-of-class engagement. And then the last few years, my work has really focused on macroethical development and emotion, because I see that this is kind of where those distinct but related lines of research all come together. And so that's what I'll be speaking to today. And so I want to start with just broadly establishing a common understanding of emotion and its role in both engineering education and ethics, and then bringing those three together to talk about recent work I have conducted looking at how the findings from that study can inform our understanding of ethical responsibility in engineering education. And so, in both everyday conversation and academic literature, emotion is variously understood and defined. So, I think maybe just take a moment to think about how you would define emotion. It's often one of those terms that, since it's used so commonly, maybe we take for granted that we all have the same understanding of it or haven't maybe paused to think about that. So think for a second how you would define that before we get into maybe the more academic and theoretical part. Because I think often when we think of emotion, it's maybe more a specific emotion that we think of, and kind of this collective noun under which many linguistics labels fall, some of which might be similar across cultures, others of which are not. And so, taking more of that theoretical approach for understanding emotion, one of the common definitions that has been cited across different disciplines is that an emotion is an episode of interrelated, synchronized changes in the states of all or most of the five organismic subsystems in response to the evaluation of an internal or external stimulus event as relevant to major concerns of the organism. So that's a bit dense. So I just want to maybe break that down a little bit to think about what does this mean for like the key features of what emotion is. So one is that it's an episode, meaning it's a short duration. So this can be distinct from something like a mood, which tends to operate over a larger time scale. It's also important to think about emotion is associated with these interrelated changes in our body. So this can be the central nervous system, the neuroendocrine system. All of these kind of communicate the different responses to what the body and the brain are experiencing. It's also important to note that emotion can be in response to this internal or external kind of triggering event, but it is anchored to something, whether that's internal or external. And then lastly, the event that triggers the emotion has to be something that the person cares about. Because if there isn't that sense of relevance, then there's not that kind of understanding of the body is experiencing this emotion. So in that way, emotions are kind of seen as these relevance detectors, because if it's something you care about, then that's something you tend to have a response to. And so, along with this kind of theoretical definition of what emotion is, a common model for understanding it is that emotion has multiple components. So these five components are shown here. So again, there's different kind of facets to it, such as like the neurophysiological. So maybe that's your heart rate changes, your face gets flushed, your palms start to sweat. There's also the motor part, so maybe your voice goes up or goes down. Your face moves in different ways to kind of communicate different emotions that you might be feeling. And then there's also just that subjective feeling. So what kind of is your internal state relative to the environment that you're in? So all of these come together and I think also show the complexity of emotion. It's not this one single thing. It's not this purely biological reaction. It's not this purely subjective response, but rather it's these different kind of components tied together that communicate the complexity of it. And so now thinking about what this means in terms of education, I think we can all kind of reflect back on experiences, whether that's as a student or as an instructor, in which you felt a strong emotion. And I think oftentimes our most memorable experiences are those that are tied to a strong emotional response. So just pause for a second and reflect on one of those times in your own educational journey. And think about that experience across these five components. So think, did maybe your heart rate start to increase, or did you start to sweat a bit? Did a big smile stretch across your face? Did your face kind of wrinkle into, and your brow furrows a bit? Did that experience make you want to freeze or maybe run out of the classroom? All of these kind of interrelated responses, again, convey that complexity and indicate both to ourselves and to others what we're going through. And in thinking about maybe the moment that you reflected on, the emotion that you experienced likely fell into one of these categories. So, work from Pekrin has identified four groups of academic emotions, and these are based on the cognitive appraisal theory of emotions, and that tends to focus on individuals' emotions and their impact. And this is often the impact on performance or skills or whatever's relevant in that kind of academic setting. So, one of these groups of academic emotions is achievement emotion, and these are related to activities and the success or failure that result from them. So, this could be pride from doing well on a project, or maybe shame from failing an exam. There's also epistemic emotions, which tend to be triggered by cognitive problems. So these really come into play when you're learning something new. And so this could be confusion from doing a difficult problem or excitement when you finally figure out the solution. There's also topic emotions, which are related to specific subjects introduced in class. So maybe you have empathy for a character you read about in an ethics case study, or you feel anxiety when you're learning about climate change. And then lastly, there are social emotions. And so these are related to the interactions that you have with peers or instructors in an academic setting. So maybe you feel compassion for one of your classmates, or you feel anger towards an instructor for making a difficult exam. And so there's a longer history of studying emotion in education more broadly and in specific contexts like primary and secondary school. But there's been a slower uptake to understand the role of emotion in engineering education. And I think this is in large part because the culture of engineering is very much associated with hardness, with rigidity, but also the idea that the content is very objective and it's strictly based on math and science. And so within engineering education and the culture of it, there's this disconnection between the technical and the social. And that's kind of mirrored by a disconnection between the rational and the emotional. And this artificial separation tends to privilege the technical and rational while largely ignoring the role of the emotional and social. But despite the kind of marginalized or discredited role of emotion in engineering, there's been growing interest in scholarship around emotion in engineering education. And this has really led to an emergent field of research in the last 20 years or so. And so, an international group of collaborators have spent the last few years kind of understanding this landscape of emotion in engineering education literature. And as shown here over that period from about 2001 to 2019, there's really been significant growth in this field. And even in the few years since then, there's been a lot more papers coming out, especially in engineering education conferences, that really look at this area. And within this field, it's really dominated by a focus on emotional intelligence, anxiety, and empathy. And those three concepts alone account for over half of the research. And this scoping review had about 200 publications, and so over half of those touched on those three primary areas. And in that review, only about 4% talked about ethics and moral emotions. So, in a relatively emergent and young field, the intersection between ethics and emotion is still quite small, even within that. And so, although, like I said, there's a small number of studies in engineering education looking at both ethics and emotion, the relationship between the two has long been contested. I'm sure there are philosophers here who can speak to this a lot better than I can, but dating back to Plato and Descartes, there was this idea that emotions are erroneous and that these kind of passions are in conflict with reason. And this idea of rationalism drove our understanding of moral judgment for hundreds of years. And even so, as kind of our understandings of moral psychology have changed, there still seemed to be this real dominance of prioritizing cognition and reason without tending to recognize the role of emotion in all of this. And that began to change a little bit in the 1990s. And there was this kind of emotion revolution in which disciplines like neuroscience, psychology, and sociology started to reconceptualize emotion. And since then, these more recent models have kind of reordered this thinking. So I want to take a moment to share an example scenario. So take a moment to read that. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body, cooked it, and ate it for dinner. Nobody saw them do this. And take a second to think, was that wrong? Did the family do anything wrong? If anyone wants to share, they're more than welcome to. Jonathan, I know you maybe have an eye on the chat better than I can because I can't quite see that. But if anyone wants to add their initial reactions to this in evaluating whether anything was done wrong here, you're welcome to pop them in the chat or say them out loud. Because this specific scenario was posed in research by Jonathan Haidt and led to the development of the social intuitionist model, which kind of again changed this thinking around emotion in kind of ethical judgment and decision making.
Michael says, eating a dog, disgusting. And
I think that's probably a common response.
Yeah. And I don't know that I've got disgust, but I've got this strong sense that that's a wrong action. Josh says, I think it's wrong for ordinary animal welfare liberation reasons. We shouldn't be eating others. I think I'm more along line with that view.
Okay. And I think that kind of speaks to there does tend to be this kind of instant visceral reaction of disgust, that's gross, that's wrong. But I think sometimes when you're pushed to justify why, it can be a bit more difficult because the dog was already dead, nobody saw them do it. They didn't break any laws, they might not even have broken any explicit kind of cultural values. But there's something to it that just doesn't sit right. And so this is what that social intuitionist model captures, is that these moral judgments are often caused by quick intuitions, and that deliberate reasoning often follows after. So instead of this very rationalist idea in which we have these slow, deliberate decision-making processes completely devoid of emotion, this kind of turns it on its head. And this was developed by a social psychologist who researches moral psychology, and I think kind of introduced a different way of thinking about the role of emotion in these kind of moral challenges or issues. And so, in thinking about this social intuitionist model, there are a few kind of key terms here to understand how this moral intuition, and again, that's not the conscious, deliberate thought process, but rather that initial reaction can indeed inform how we judge situations. So, how we evaluate a person or an event based on the set of values or virtues that we hold to be right or wrong. And so it was kind of work around these morally ambiguous scenarios that tend to elicit these strong reactions that led to this kind of different way of thinking. And so, kind of within this broader umbrella of ethics or morality, I also now want to shift a bit more towards professional ethics. And so, in this case, thinking about the principles that govern the behavior of members of a certain group. So, professions like law, medicine, and engineering have these principles or guidelines that that kind of tell people within the group how they're expected to conduct themselves. And so the first quote here is from the National Society of Professional Engineers in the US. And it's kind of recognizing engineering as this profession in which there are high standards of honesty and integrity, and people within that group are expected to adhere to them and conduct themselves in a way that is ethical based on the kind of premise that they offer. And within engineering education, this comes into play, for example, in the accreditation of programs. And so, in order for an engineering program to be accredited, there has to be a demonstration that students within it demonstrate learning outcomes related to ethical and professional responsibilities. So, at kind of a top down effort, these can be powerful levers to really communicate the importance of ethics and making it very relevant to professional engineering and engineering education. And so, as previously discussed, there is this overlap between ethics, emotion, and engineering education. But kind of the Venn diagram between the three has had so far fairly limited coverage in the literature. So I worked with a few collaborators on a systematic literature review for emotion in engineering ethics education. And we identified 30 papers that substantively engaged with all three. And that work tended to be underpinned by a focus on empathy, moral emotions, and emotional intelligence. So, again, it's a relatively small research area, but even so is really predominated by these three conceptual frameworks for tying together emotion and ethics. So next, I want to move into looking at this a bit more concretely in terms of one of the projects that I did as a part of my fellowship 2 years ago. And so this study looked at the interplay between emotion and ethical responsibility among engineering students. And so I spent 2 years in Belgium, and a few of those, a few months in the UK during that time as well, to understand how civil and architectural engineering students conceive of their responsibility as future engineers and the factors inside and outside the classroom that shape it. And so the quote shown here, I think one of our lecturers used to say, a doctor can kill one person at a time and a civil engineer can kill 1,000, came from an interview that I did with a final year undergraduate civil engineering student. And I think it really encapsulates both the professional and emotional weight of responsibility that these engineering students across the study expressed. And so this study particularly focused on civil and architectural engineering students because I think they're uniquely situated at the intersection between the natural and built environment. They tend to work on large-scale projects, infrastructure, buildings, the kind of projects that we see and perceive in our everyday lives. And so they have a very tangible impact on the public, but one that is often taken for granted, I think, until something goes wrong. Um, and so the study particularly looked at those disciplines of students. And so I was interested in understanding the emotions that these students expressed in relation to their future responsibility as professional engineers. And tying back into the culture part, how, if at all, the engineering culture within their educational experience affected how students express and experience these emotions. And so this study tied into moral emotions. And so these are linked to the interests of the welfare of either society as a whole or other people. And so this, I think, connects well with those understandings of engineering having to hold paramount to the welfare of the public, because these moral emotions again relate to others and kind of judgments for right or wrong in relation to that. And moral emotions can also be seen as cultural scripts that are shaped by local values and meanings. So, again, this shows that there's really a cultural underpinning to moral emotions because our evaluation or judgment of a person or experience is in relation to the values or virtues that we have learned to evaluate as either right or wrong. And so moral emotions are defined by two features. So one being the extent to which the triggering event affects the self. So prototypical moral emotions mean the self has very little stake in the triggering event. So this could be feeling a sense of compassion when you're reading about an injustice on the other side of the world. You personally have no stake in it, but it elicits this interest for others. And then the other primary feature is the extent to which the triggering event motivates action. So this sense of pro-social action is the other kind of spectrum. And so if you read about this injustice, does that motivate you to donate money to a humanitarian organization? And so the prototypical moral emotions, such as anger, guilt, and compassion, have little self-interest but high pro-social action. So that's why they fall in that top quadrant. And so these various emotions shown here can fall at different kind of points within on those two axes, but to be the more prototypical moral emotions, it's the low interest in self, but high pro-social motivation. And so, as that definition of moral emotion includes, there are really these cultural underpinnings to understanding emotion. So, traditionally, or in the more classical sense, emotion was viewed as something that's very biological and universal, that emotions are built in from birth and they kind of have this distinct circuit or response within our bodies. But more contemporary scholarship and meta-analyses have shown that there aren't these distinct facial, physiological, or neurological fingerprints for emotions, but rather they're culturally constructed. So that's why in this study I was really interested in looking at that intersection between moral emotions and the culture of engineering education in relation to societal responsibility. And so, bringing those two research questions together, I identified the moral emotions that students expressed in relation to their future responsibility and the kind of cultural underpinnings that seem to be contributing to this experience and expression of emotion. So I'll just briefly touch on these themes with representative quotes from the student interviews. Because as a qualitative researcher, I think the participants can always tell their stories far better than I can. And so I think they really capture these different emotions and how their experience in engineering education was contributing to them. So the most common moral emotion that came up in the vast majority of the interviews was the sense of fear. And so fear is a moral emotion in that it can motivate pro-social action and it can be triggered by a concern for others. So as an example of what that looked like, one student talked about how there's a really big sense of responsibility in engineering because if you're designing something, for example, a material, and if it is used in a building and somehow fails, people's life will depend on it. And if it collapses with a lot of people in it within it, that comes with a lot of responsibility. And so the student went on to say that it's pretty scary knowing that if you are responsible for this small mistake, people's lives can end. And so again, there was this sense of fear out of the harm that could happen to other people based on a mistake that an engineer could make. And another example of this was a student talking about, again, how they felt really scared in reflecting on their future responsibility. And so I think this student felt this kind of conflict where it is really cool that you can be a part of a skyscraper or a skyline and have that kind of impact. But at the same time, the student went on to say, if there are 300 people in that building and it crashes down, it's your fault. And if that landmark fails, people die. And so when students were expressing this sense of fear, it really came down to a pretty narrow understanding of what responsibility is, as in its buildings or bridges collapsed. And so although that was, again, a kind of narrow understanding of it, it was still that it would have catastrophic implications. And so the student talked about how that could actually hold people back from studying engineering or pursuing a career as an engineer because of kind of that fear of responsibility. But there were also more emotions that had kind of a positive valence, such as pride, which can motivate pro-social behavior, and pride tends to come from a feeling of responsibility or over a socially valued outcome. And so, for example, one student talked about how they were really excited to be an engineer because they saw the potential within it. And so this student did, for example, a work placement working on a tunnel that was going to provide clean electric power. And so this sense that although this is a large responsibility, it's something that you can really be proud of because it's something that can have a really important impact on other people in a very clear and tangible way. And then the third moral emotion that students expressed was compassion, and this really came from a motivation to help others. So for one student, when asked to kind of reflect on how they felt about their responsibility, what came to mind for them was hope and prosperity. And this idea that as an engineer, you have the ability to positively impact society. You can make systems more efficient, you can make them help people in more effective ways. And that really lent the sense of wanting to help others and being able to use engineering as a means to that end. And so, looking at kind of the sociocultural context within engineering education, one of the most common ways students talked about learning about anything related to ethics or responsibility was learning through disaster. So that tended to be examples or case studies of kind of catastrophic failure. And so this one student in the UK talked about across their whole degree program, there was one module, and within that, one lecture on ethics. And the entire focus of that one session was on making sure your bridge doesn't fall down, because if it does, 1,000 people can die, and that'll be on you. So again, it's this fairly narrow conception of what responsibility means and framed in these very high stakes examples. There was also this sense that students learned that engineering is a matter of life and death, that again, when things go wrong, it can be catastrophic, and when it does, it's the engineer's fault, whoever made that mistake, whoever signed off on that design. And so the public puts a lot of trust into civil engineers, but that it's a very high stakes profession, and that sense of learning about ethics or responsibility through these cases really communicated the potentially catastrophic effects if things do go wrong. And then lastly, although there were some instances of learning about these examples or case studies, students really reflected that it had limited visibility in the curriculum. And so often it was one professor or one lecture in one class that happened to mention this. And so the quote from the student here talked about how they hadn't really ever thought beyond the obvious, make sure your design doesn't collapse, until one professor discussed it in class and talked about it more from an accessibility standpoint. So how do architectural engineering students make buildings accessible rather than how do we just make sure they don't fall down? And so talking about how this was a bit of a turning point for them, because it hadn't come up before. And when it finally did, then they started to see responsibility kind of in different facets of architectural engineering. And so thinking about what this means in terms of engineering education and how we're forming students' sense of responsibility as future engineers, really thinking about what and how we teach matters. The way that uh, examples and case studies are framed and the focus of them can really affect both how students emotionally engage in that content, but also more broadly how they emotionally engage in their understanding of what engineering is and what engineers do. And so whether these responses have a positive or negative valence, they can be really impactful. And how certain cases, especially when they're these very high stakes, can lead to emotional over-arousal, in which the consequences can seem so dire, the stakes can seem so high that students can be kind of turned off from it or shut down because it seems like too daunting of a task. And so thinking about how in engineering education, the dominant approach for teaching ethics really is these high stakes disaster scenarios, thinking about whether a fear-based approach creates a sense of despair rather than empowerment. And if we do want to facilitate ethical action and ethical courage as outcomes within engineering ethics education, how do we foster that? So rather than just making students aware of these issues, if we want to get to these kind of higher order outcomes around action and courage, what are going to be more effective ways to do that rather than these kind of fear-based approaches? And potentially are approaches such as integrating positive emotions or moral exemplars in case studies a way to counterbalance this approach and maybe not completely untangle engineering ethics from these large scale disasters, but rather offering other approaches into the problem in order to maybe facilitate more of these positive emotions, which can also be really impactful and really motivating for engineering students. So these questions, I think, will continue to keep me and all of us busy. So I'm not claiming to have them answered yet, but I think in considering the role of emotion in ethics education, it can help us maybe start to ask different questions and think of different ways of answering them. So that was all I had, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments, or if you know the answer to these questions. I know Michael Louie's on the call, so maybe he does.
Abby, thank you. That was great. Yes, Michael does have two questions for you, and then I have jotted down several that you've stimulated for me. So let's just keep it low key. And Michael, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Either one, but maybe particularly about the disaster cases. That got me thinking.
Oh, okay. I'm about to type yet another one.
Oh,
So,
yes.
well, no, I don't want to dominate the call here. So my first question was actually related to your final question here. Let me get my video is not turning on. There we go. Sorry about that. So my question is that uh, what positive emotions can we talk about the positive emotions that might be evoked by exemplary cases such as elevation and admiration for role models, and then awe for um, uh, beautiful artifacts like magnificent skyscrapers. Is there any work on that? Is that um, I mean that's basically I'm asking the question that you actually raised there. Do you know of any partial results? And then I'm going to ask my second question.
Okay, yes. So I know, so a few of my colleagues in Switzerland have started to look at more these positive emotions, but
Mm,
more from a compassion standpoint.
mm,
So thinking about how emotion, I think, is inherent in all of these cases. It's not always acknowledged, but it's there in terms of how students respond to it or even just think about what's
mhm,
happening. And so making that engagement with positive emotions more explicit in terms of instead of thinking just how do we avoid disaster, maybe thinking
mhm,
about engineering as a way to kind of facilitate compassion and empathy. And so I think that is one potential avenue into
mhm,
thinking about these more positive emotions.
mhm. Right. And then there are even other positive emotions that could be not exploited, but evoked
Mhm.
and used. The second one I just sent it to Jonathan is actually I want to advance a further defense of traditional disaster cases. First of all, because they are part of the culture of each field, Each field has its own classic disaster cases, Bhopal for chemical engineers, Challenger for aerospace engineers, and so on. And that's part of the socialization into giving each the students in each field a common experience and part of the common knowledge of the field. And the second one is that these negative cases are more memorable. And so they are ones that, because negative emotions tend to be more visceral and provide stronger memories, we remember the bee sting more than the sweetness of the honey. They do facilitate learning. So how would you respond to the benefits of my proposed benefits of traditional disaster cases?
No, and I completely agree with you. I do think that these tend to be the more memorable ones. I mean, even in these interviews, maybe they did learn
Mhm.
more positive things, but when they were
Yeah.
prompted to reflect on it, they didn't come up with anything. So I think there is maybe a bit of that negativity bias, and or just these tend to be
Hmm.
impactful. So I think more what I'm proposing is not doing away with these, but rather
Okay.
broadening and offering a counterbalance. So instead of just teaching ethics in this one lecture with one disaster case study, are there ways to provide a more holistic approach so that
Hmm.
students can engage with these ideas in different ways? And maybe having more engagement with some of these positive emotions in order to, I guess, balance it out a little. So instead of
Yes.
doing away with it, making it more holistic so that
Yes.
there are different ways into this conversation.
That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Maddie, I know Michael is gonna be very kind and not ask his third question, but I've sort of developed three buckets of questions for you. One on theories of emotion, one on the role of emotions in engineering, which is where we are now, and then one on sort of the intuitionists and problems around there. And Michael, to put words in your mouth, I think your third question is in that last bucket about emotional judgments and intuitionists. And Michael, Maddie in the chat asked a really interesting question about, besides pride and compassion, is there a place of positive emotion for something like awe? Like Michael's example is standing before a magnificent skyscraper. Awe has these different kind of connotations to it, especially against pride and compassion. But I wonder if you'd thought at all about that, the place of awe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think in some of the interviews, that's what students were touching on in this sense of like, I could be a part of the skyline. I could create this skyscraper. Um, and so I think sometimes they can hold both of these things to be true at the same time. Maybe in in order to be a part of something that generates such awe, it comes with a certain degree of responsibility. And so, no, I think that's a great point, and I think it can also connect to that sense of pride too, of being proud of being a part of something as significant and as impactful. Um, I think there's always a bit of a balance between overstating the importance of engineers in terms of there could be a bit of that kind of professional hubris of some of the engineers in the study talked about, being better than others because we're a part of this. So I think maybe not crossing that line, but instead thinking about how to cultivate that sense of pride and awe, um, and thinking about how that can be very positive. And I think the big thing too is just helping students understand that their one mistake likely won't lead to something catastrophic. And so I think part of it too is just saying these things do happen, but you as an individual are a part of a much greater context, and you're going to have colleagues and bosses, and you're going to have people looking over your work, and like, don't be afraid to make mistakes and don't be afraid to try, because that's part of being a professional, and that you're going to be in an organization where you'll hopefully have many people kind of looking over your shoulder rather than thinking, um, if I make one calculation wrong, that's what sent the whole building. And so being a part of a culture and an organizational culture that can kind of facilitate that growth rather than thinking it's this very individual responsibility.
Makes sense to me. You know, it's interesting. As you were talking about awe and engineers being part of something that generates awe, that is the opposite of direction that I thought you were going to go. Because when I think about awe, it's my standing in front of something that gives me a sense of awe.
Mm.
And maybe that was Michael's example. Standing in front of a beautiful skyscraper is both beautiful and awful, like in that traditional sense that it's like bigger than you and sets you in your place and sort of. So there's two sides to that. One, engineers might see themselves as being part of something that generates awe for others, but then maybe there's the other case where they stand in front of something and they're part of something bigger, and it makes them feel situated. It makes them feel a sense of awe rather than generate awe. Two sides to
Yeah,
that.
no, I think, yeah, exactly. The both can be true.
Yeah, yeah. Super interesting. Okay. I said 3 buckets, and I want to turn to Corbin because Corbin is going to shift us over to thinking about roles of emotions in engineering specifically. And Corbin, you've got 2 questions. You can take your pick. If you're around, you're welcome to unmute and ask.
All right. Let's see. So the first one was, so you argued that emotions are primarily cultural based. Should engineering societies focus on developing shared emotions without other emotions? So if we can develop a culture ourselves, should we intentionally decide which emotions to keep? For example, should something like fear be eliminated while keeping something like seeking perfection in the project? Could an emotion like success, specifically based on collaboration, be useful to create? And is that even possible? Or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So if emotions are culturally constructed, should we as engineers decide which ones to keep and to bin? And I think first of all, that is very thought-provoking. And I think it's so complex because I think in many ways that does already happen. I think when you're in an engineering classroom, you're expected to act in certain ways. But it's not also that it's based on different cultures. So gender, race, and ethnicity, all of these kind of factors come into influencing the ways that we experience and express emotions. Not wanting to seem too enthusiastic, not wanting to seem too proud, not wanting to seem too scared, but not wanting to seem too humble. So I think in many ways that is happening all around us all the time. And I think the different subcultures can create these various and sometimes conflicting messages about what we're supposed to be experiencing and expressing. And within engineering ed, a lot of that kind of work now has started to look at like emotional labor. And so how as either teachers or students, the environment around us is hindering how we are expressing and feeling and the labor it takes to be very mindful of that. So I'm not entirely sure that answered your question, but maybe it just sparked some other thoughts in me. But I do think all the time our different cultures are affecting which emotions we express, which ones are privileged, which ones are not. But it's of course very complicated, and in a lot of the cultures that affect that, we've been a part of since birth rather than coming into an engineering classroom, for example, kind of devoid of any of that.
Corbin, how do you feel? Are you satisfied? You want to follow up?
Yeah. So I think what I heard was emotions are affected by the workplace and teaching place, but we can't control it completely because of other factors like demographics and stuff. So we are not able to completely isolate and create new emotions as we want, but it comes to a certain extent of changing how those emotions are portrayed. Yes? Is that
Yeah,
what you said?
yeah. Yeah, I think so. And there's different the sociologists would say it is entirely cultural. Some of the psychologists would say it's entirely biological. I think the reality is it's probably to an extent a combination of the two. And so that's why it can be challenging to mediate because there are all of these different, both biological and cultural factors across so many different levels that kind of play into the complexity of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Polmear, we've got two more questions kind of in the same bucket about the roles of emotions in engineering. And I wanted to ask one of mine really quickly. You got me thinking about the role of moral exemplars in this space. And I wonder what you think, what your take is on moral exemplars in the context of emotion. Because when I think of moral exemplars, I think of people whose actions or orientation, actions or intention are something that I want to emulate, but I don't think I really consider it in terms of their emotional states. So I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit about exemplars and emotion.
Yeah, sure. So I think, so the way I was conceptualizing it was more that exemplars, yeah, indeed have a way of eliciting different responses. So instead of a disaster eliciting fear or anxiety, maybe an exemplar can elicit a sense of pride or ethical courage. And maybe that can tap into different motivation. Because fear can be motivating, but positive emotions can motivate as well. So I think it maybe comes down to that balance of instead of just coming at kind of ethics and responsibilities from this more fear-based approach, if there's a way to demonstrate more of those outcomes around like empowerment and finding different ways to connect. Because maybe some students, I think, on just an individual basis, can find different things motivating. So I think that's the potential role of the exemplars.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Just to follow on, I think what I was thinking through as you were talking was I've got in my own case like different exemplars, let's call them mentors that sort of stand out to me. In some contexts, those are people of really high emotion, even sometimes anger, if they're really passionate, say about animal ethics or something, they really get worked up and they've got this power to their argument. And then there's other exemplars that exhibit, demonstrate, exemplify this sort of stoic calm in the face of disaster or whatever. And both of those are exemplary to me for different reasons. And I think that's really interesting too, that there might be moments or conditions under which you'd want one set of emotions versus another, and you have to look to different sources of inspiration. Does that resonate?
Yeah, no, that definitely does. And I think that can be very impactful and again, people will resonate with different different emotions and like what the context calls for. So yeah, I know I really like that idea of, and again, I think it's approaching it from different angles, knowing that it'll land in different ways and have a different impact on people. And
That makes sense. Yeah. Two more quick in this bucket. One from Steve and one from Jackie. So, Steve, you've got a question that is pedagogically oriented. If you want to ask.
Yeah, thanks very much. So given what you've said about the role of emotion in engineering, how do you think we teach, or how should we be teaching engineers to navigate the complex intersection between personal values, those of the company, the client, and the profession? So, there's the age-old example. I think it's age-old. A company wants to design something, maybe it's a rail line. They want it cheapest. The designer wants it to be aesthetically pleasing. The company wants it to be safest as the first priority, and maybe the profession advances sustainability, and those values have to be balanced. Does emotion and your arguments tell us anything about how we should be teaching engineers to navigate those value challenges?
yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think you're right. It speaks so well to the kind of competing and conflicting values. And I think sometimes just first of all, just acknowledging that those can exist, and instead of framing these issues as very straightforward and with like a very clear solution, I think sometimes just acknowledging that uncertainty and ambiguity can be very impactful because that is the reality of it. And I think pedagogically getting students to sit with that uncertainty and ambiguity and building that into design projects, for example. And so students have to wrestle with these in more kind of authentic scenarios. Um, and I think knowing that it will inevitably have maybe emotional consequences, or again, that emotional labor of just saying it's okay if you feel uncomfortable with that, and figuring out maybe on in that context what the best way forward is. Um, which I realize maybe I think so getting students comfortable with that ambiguity and uncertainty, acknowledging the conflict, creating authentic um, pedagogies in which they can work through those on a smaller scale. So then they develop a bit more of that confidence or comfort in wrestling with those, knowing that when they get into a more complicated organizational context, those kind of issues will come up. But I think again, also grounding them in what will be kind of the guiding principle. So if these things are in conflict, what is the kind of what is the value set that you want to move forward with?
Thank you very much. That was helpful.
Jackie Sullivan, you're up next if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, thank you very much, Dr. Polmear, for being here. We're very grateful. I too teach Introduction to Engineering. We actually have 1,975 freshman engineers this fall. So it is quite a chore. They are very diverse. You're literally teaching to the masses. Dr. Kubler, with your question, I mean, the way I answer what you asked, I simply tell the students that there are so many different factions that are going to come your way potentially, but first and foremost is always public safety. So I figure, talking to a lot of people, if I can get that one concept through to them, that's probably the best, that we can do. And again, teaching to this large audience. But one of the questions I had was, when we discuss ethics and we, present the tragedies and whatnot, I kind of circle back toward academic integrity. Mm-hmm. And I kind of remind them that, this is serious. You're not in high school anymore. It's not one and done anymore. Your courses build upon themselves. And the phrase that you've heard, but maybe it never really sunk in, you're only cheating yourself. Well, it goes deeper now with engineering because you are cheating yourself, but by doing that, you can cheat the result of a project, or you're cheating your capability of doing a good job. So I was just curious, is that an okay thing to do in your opinion, or am I really scaring them too much?
No, I mean, I think first of all, we always complain about having to teach 300 students, so I can imagine that is a huge undertaking. And I think making that that sense of relevance, like having something that students can connect to, and oftentimes, academic integrity or academic dishonesty is something they can relate to. If they don't have that professional experience, at least they can kind of ground what they're learning about in something. And I think oftentimes that can be very effective.
Right.
And so I think in that sense, if it's something that they can relate to and also realize that the kind of scale or the magnitude is changing, and will continue to grow with that sense of responsibility, then yeah, it sounds like it can be quite effective.
Okay, Debbie. I appreciate that. Thank you. Oh, I have one more quick question. So here at UCF, we do not teach what I would call a one and done ethics and engineering course. We instill it in all of the upper level, the 3 and 4,000 level courses. In addition to when they're freshmen, they get exposed to it as well. In all of your work and your research, are there many, is there a great divide that like you feel like half the institutions do the one class and half integrate it into the upper level courses? I was just curious, the uniqueness or not of that approach.
Yeah, so that's a lot of my PhD work looked at how ethics is taught in engineering around the US and to a certain extent in other countries as well, which is how I originally connected with Dr. Beaver. And it seemed the dominant or the most common approach at like across the US is still very much the one and done. Like the either it tended to be in an intro to engineering or in capstone design. But I
Mhm.
would say the model of integrating it across technical courses or across different years in the degree program is still less common. Now
Mhm.
that could have changed in the last 5 years or so. But I would say since accreditation by and large still drives things and it's still somewhat a matter of um, compliance and kind of bean counting,
Mhm.
doing enough is enough. And so I think taking these more integrative approaches, um, I would still say tends to be less common. But it's wonderful to hear that it's being done there. And at the
Yeah.
university I'm at too, I think it's been quite intentional that we teach design every single semester and in all of those modules, um, ethics and like sustainability have to be integrated to some extent. And it's
Well,
not taught in like a standalone
yeah.
course at all.
Okay. I was hoping you liked that approach. I do too, and I hope we keep it. Now, though, I'm thinking, hey, we got to add sustainability in there. So, okay, I found my next mountain to climb here. Thank
There
you.
you go. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Um, Matt, just maybe one more question in this same bucket. I think I'm torn between whether you're intending that in engineering programs we should be I don't know how to even describe it, teaching to emotions, like drawing emotions out of our students as a way of motivating them, um, or if we should be using emotions to drive reasoning practices or some combination. And that all got me thinking of this experience I had in grad school. A professor of mine was teaching animal ethics for whatever, been 30 years. And he always started the course by having students watch these really violent, graphic animal rights sort of videos. And he said over 30 years, every semester he would convert about a third of his class to vegetarians for 3 months after his class, but then almost all of them would revert. And so I think that all got me thinking about your take on the staying power of emotions in engineering, right? Is there a
Mhm.
sense that like there's something different about how far emotions can take us in professionalism as opposed to reasoning, the classic distinction in philosophy?
Yeah. So I think maybe the first step is just acknowledging that these emotions do exist and the way that we teach can elicit different emotions rather than kind of going with the engineering stereotype and tradition of pretending they're not there. And so I think that what I would say is maybe like what I hope is the first low-hanging fruit step of acknowledging that students have emotions, acknowledging the way we teach affects their emotions, and that it has a role in what we're doing. And these don't need to be downplayed, they don't need to be ignored, but they do need to be wrestled with. And so I think there is definitely the risk of emotional over arousal, and it sounds like um, showing those kind of videos probably cross that line because there's also a bit of research that shows that's not effective. And in some of these ethics case studies, having too much of that has a counterproductive effect in terms of then how students perform on like an ethical reasoning sort of assessment. So I think it's not trying to play so far into that students then can shut down because they're overwhelmed. But I think, again, just acknowledging that they're there, that they have a role, and that it might be helpful to play to, or to understand that different emotions can engage us in different ways, and that maybe a broader spectrum of them have a role in what we're doing.
That makes really good sense. Yeah. I don't think I made that connection in my own thinking about this animal ethics class, but certainly a case of over-arousal.
Yeah.
Steve, you've got a question. Go ahead.
It just struck me as you were speaking, Madeline, about how powerful emotion can be to create a sense of community or alienation from a community. And that got me thinking about medical school. When you join a medical school, they have a coding ceremony. And it's very impactful, very emotional. You know, you're now part of this medical community. You're not a doctor yet, but you're one of us. And you know, to some extent, I probably think that makes students take it so much more seriously, and you know, in understand, as Jackie was saying, how important what they're doing is. And I don't know, does engineering really have anything
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, we
Does it
do.
need it?
Well, they've got the Order of the Engineer where
Yeah.
you receive that ring, the ring that you put that ring on, and there's a pledge and all of that. So yeah, at UCF we do that as well. And I feel that we do ours at a separate like ceremony, while, for example, at the University of Florida, it's at the graduation. Everyone stands up together and they put that ring on and they hear that pledge. So I think it's a good thing myself, personally.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what do you think, Madeline? Is it something that needs to be on the back end when you graduate, or on the front end when
Maybe
you're
move.
brought into that community, or are we just playing with hocus pocus and magic and it's not really meaningful fundamentally?
Mm.
No, I think that's an interesting question. Yeah, and as Jackie said, I've heard about it in those terms of like the oath and the ring ceremonies. And I think, as with anything, the effectiveness of it will probably vary, and maybe it doesn't have quite as strong of a cultural sense as like the white coat ceremony, for example. But I think if it can communicate to students that these issues are a part of the profession, and now if you're a part of that profession, you kind of you share those obligations. Um, so yeah, I think it probably has benefits in terms of making those kind of ideas explicit. But I don't know. I'd say it would be interesting to see kind of the impact of that on students once they get into the profession, because I'm not sure that I don't know the answer to that.
Mhm,
But I would be very interested to find out myself.
mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stephen, we'll talk offline, but something I could envision, the freshmen coming in after their first year, and we've got that group that's going to kind of keep pushing through, having something where they realize that, again, we say that this is the next 3 years are very critical. You know, the academic integrity must be there because you're assuming a role. I tell the freshmen before they leave me next spring that I put doctors here and I put engineers here. It's just one is the physical person and taking care of the human being from a physical standpoint, and then the other is, the public safety. Everything, all the infrastructure that they touch, they impact people just as much as the doctor. And so when I say that, I do see little light bulbs tend to go on, like, wow, yeah, this is I will have a big responsibility, won't I? So yeah, maybe Stephen, or Jonathan too, we can all maybe come up with something that would be super cool to do for the freshmen as they leave as freshmen and embark upon the next 3 years. But again, this has been a very exciting conversation for me. So I'm so grateful to all of you for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
We could keep going. I have more questions, Maddie, sort of on the philosophy of motion side. But if there are other questions from the audience, please let me know. I might leave the philosophy questions because I feel like they're a little on the selfish side, outside of the context of engineering, but we can
I would
talk.
be happy to chat about those another time though.
Yeah. That sounds great. Maddie, thank you so much. This was great. I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise, and it's so great for us to be able to track the work you're doing. So thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to chat with you all. I really appreciated the questions and comments. And I think all of my non-answers sometimes show that these are things I want to continue thinking about as well.
Yeah, right on.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Polmear, for helping us understand how emotion can affect this interplay between ethics and engineering. And as always, I want to thank Jonathan for expert moderation of our discussion, but thank you, participants, for great questions and engagement. We're going to post the recording for this presentation. It'll be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can share it with others or view it again. And you'll also be able there to find links to past talks. So go back and look at those. We've had some very exciting talks over the years. And again, share them with your friends and tell us what kind of topics you'd like to see in the future. But to that, I'll now tell you about what our next event is. Give me a moment here to share the slides here. Hopefully that appeared. So chatbots have improved at a remarkable pace, not just in sounding more like humans, but also in their ability to make what seems like good decisions. But whether a decision is good or not depends upon so many factors, which includes, not only the technology of the chatbot system, but also how chatbots are trained, what's in the training database, and who does the training. And in our next Ethically Speaking event, we're going to explore this topic in a discussion led by Dr. David Grant, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Florida. Dr. Grant is an expert in ethics of emerging technologies, and he earned his PhD at MIT and then held several prestigious postdoc fellowships at Harvard, the Jane Family Institute, and the Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society at UCLA. Dr. Grant has some intriguing insights into this complex question of how much we should rely on chatbots, and he notes that there are many potential benefits, but also potential risks. So join us to find out what those are and how we can all be part of this, hopefully society-wide conversation. I hope you'll visit the UCF Center for UCF Center for Ethics website now to register for that event. I just want to remind you that Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the many UCF partners that you see here, and also research that we've done with funding from the National Science Foundation. And it's made possible also by your great engagement. We really appreciate that. I'd like to thank these sponsors for bringing this, helping us bring this to you, and you for helping us keep it going through your interest. And I hope you'll join us in future presentations of Ethically Speaking.